For me, Texas Lit has been such an important class to teach. We didn't have a Texas Lit class at Texas A&M. We had a Southwest Lit, but that was sort of developed by someone who looked more toward Arizona and New Mexico. And I thought, you know, Texans love Texas. This is something we like to talk about. And so I started to think about what would make a really engaging course for the students. And what I found is that this class in particular is really great to teach those students who are somewhat resistant to traditional text, who maybe don't see themselves in text, don't know where they fit in, don't know how to understand things that seem so far away. I always talk to my students about how when we teach American literature, you know, the traditional American literature canon is so focused on the East Coast, and the students are like, where are we? We're developing things over here. Now that's shifted a bit, but I think they still have this perception that literature is about those other people doing other things that has nothing to do with me. And so Texas Lit and teaching Texas text broadly really will engage your students. When I taught this class before, I came up with a couple concerns from teachers, and I wanted to just review them because they may be similar to your concerns. Texas Lit's a little tricky to teach because probably you didn't have a Texas Lit class. There's not a real standard curriculum. We're starting to develop one, but it's not like it's been there for, you know, 200 years, 250 years like American literature studies. So what do I teach? How do I do this? How do I represent the diversity of Texas? You have all kinds of different communities that you're engaging with in your local schools. How do I get these resources? I don't have money. The school doesn't have money. How do I find this stuff? And, you know, I see over and over again that you are like asking these questions of how do I teach writing? How do I help underserved students? This might include some ESL support. And of course, the perennial question that every teacher has is, how do I motivate students? How do I engage them? How do I get them excited about this material, right? Because that's always a problem for us. So I'm going to try to make sure I hit some of these concerns as I walk through my slides. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them on the Q&A. Marissa's going to help me monitor that. She can interrupt me if there seems to be a pertinent question. We can talk about these at the end of the discussion as well. So Texas Lit was a brand new course for us at Texas A&M. I developed it in fall of 2014. It's actually been taught now by several folks, and they all have kind of their own take on it. One of my graduate students taught it very successfully using a lot of WPA text and sort of focusing on prison narratives and the history of Jim Crow, and that worked really well for her. But basically, when we developed this course, we knew that we wanted to make it broad. So I wanted both literature, but also cultural and multimedia kinds of components that would respond to the rich cultural diversity in the state. And to leave it up to the instructors to see where they wanted to go with this. And I think that's what's really neat about teaching Texas Lit, which sort of is an amorphous kind of area still. You have a lot of flexibility, so you can look at your students in your particular teaching environment and think about what will best resonate with them. And that can be really powerful. All right. So let's get into the heart of it, right? The TEKS. And let me just emphasize a couple areas that I think we can think about as we engage with teaching Texas Lit. The TEKS really emphasizes this listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking, and multiple genres, as well as oracy and authentic reading and reflective writing. And the way I interpret that is that oracy is something that we want our students to do, but also to learn about. And so, you know, this sort of multiple genres approach can be really exciting because we don't have to just use literary text. We can bring other things in to teach these skills. When I teach Texas Lit, there's three main points I hammer on all semester because it gives the students sort of that umbrella to hang on, to hang ideas on. They need a continual narrative, and that's how I teach all my courses. What's the big umbrella idea, and how do these small pieces we read fit into it? So we spend a lot of time talking about narratives of Texas. That's the framework for our class. And we use critical inquiry and writing to think about these different narratives. I tell them there are multiple stories of Texas, right? I use a broad idea of Texas cultural text. So we do statues, and you know, it seems pertinent now, right? But we've been doing this, I've been doing built environment statues for like 10 years, but it seems really pertinent now, right? We read movies, we read music, we read foodways, and the students love this, right? Who wouldn't like their instructor bringing them a big plate of kolaches or breakfast tacos, right? So we can talk about all these sort of things that they don't think of as something to critically engage with, but once you sort of introduce that concept, it's much more comfortable for them to think about music or foodways than a literary text. So it becomes an entry back to that literary text. And I also try to use multiple points of engagement to meet the students where they are. We do formal and informal writing. We stair-step things. So if they have a big research paper, we do little pieces as we go along. Some of those little pieces might be presentations. Some of them might be collaborative work. And I'll give you some examples of how I do this as I move through my presentation. Also, just so you know, a lot of the things I talk about are included in the classroom. I've included a page that has a bunch of links to it. The slides are there. So if you don't get the link or write down something as we go through, don't worry, it's there. I've also included my prompts, because I know it helps to have something to take away that you can basically copy over and make your changes and deal with. And you'll see I do the same thing. We share those materials, and you're welcome to use them in however you see fit. If they help you going back into the classroom, that's really great. So back to the TEKS, I want to talk about these response skills and think about this idea of multiple text and a variety of sources, and how getting them engaged with this and to write and think and respond to it, it works really well when you think through this through the narrative texts, because most of our students have already thought about this. It may not have been something they've critically thought about, but they all have a narrative of Texas. So we start off with this idea of, how does Texas imagine itself, right? Texans love to talk about Texas. We love to think about Texas as unique, right? So we start there. And then we talk about how Texas literature thinks and rethinks history. I always joke with my students that no matter what we do in Texas Lit, we always end up back at the Alamo. It is everywhere and always. But the idea of the narrative of the Alamo is not consistent. Different writers and groups interpret the Alamo in different ways. And I think that you know, when you think about contemporary events, I was thinking about the folks that went and they were concerned about the Alamo being tagged, or they were concerned about the Alamo being torn down. That shows a very particular understanding of the Alamo that not everybody shares. So it's actually a good time to think about these things. Also, what are the mythologies or stories or narratives we tell about Texas? So I tell people, this is a literature class, not a history class. We talk about narratives. So there isn't one right answer. There's multiple interpretations here. And I think that we're often nervous about talking about certain kinds of aspects of text or ideas. By emphasizing narratives, it kind of takes the pressure off, because we're saying, look, this is one idea. You don't have to like that idea. You don't have to buy into that idea, but let's think about this as a narrative and then use it as a way to move forward. And that usually kind of disarms the resistant students a little bit as we keep going back to, it's a narrative. We're not talking about truths with a big T. We're talking about how stories and ideas are developed. So we start off with Texas myths and motifs. So the first couple weeks of class is all about, like, what makes Texas Texas? What stories do we tell about ourselves? And I like to start with these two different representations of Texas and sort of think through this. We have Davy Crockett's letter, right? Texas is the garden spot of the world. And usually my students will say, like, I'm from West Texas. I don't quite understand how it's the garden spot of the world. And then you have this very famous quote by Sheridan, who says, if I owned Texas in hell, I would rent out Texas and live in hell. And you see certain narratives, like when we read cowboy songs, there's a lot of this discussion about, you know, everything in Texas is trying to kill me. They've got fire ants, they've got rattlesnakes. Texas is hell for the cowboy. So they can start to see how these different narratives develop. And it becomes less an us and them kind of response. So we usually start off the first class by, like, what slogans do you know about Texas? What quotes do you know? And we talk about how other states don't necessarily have this. This is definitely a Texas thing. You know, you may go to hell, but I will go to Texas. You know, don't mess with Texas. Texas bigger and better. All these ideas, they know them, right? They've heard them from, you know, for a very long time. And I say, I grew up in Maryland. I can't give you one slogan about Maryland. I don't know. We don't have a quote, right? So what is it about Texas that we think this way about our state and we understand these things about our state. So that again, we're thinking about narratives early on. One of the best ways to teach this, and I just love this, is to go to the Don't Mess with Texas ad archive. So there's a link here. It's also in your sheet. But I pull a couple of those really short Texas, Don't Mess with Texas ads. And we talk about like, what does it mean that there's this cowboy myth that plays out? Or, you know, why is it so important to show Chuck Norris from this position of strength? Like, why do these ads work? What about it resonates with us? Because this has been one of the most successful ad campaigns, right, that we've had in Texas. What is it that works? And plus it's fun because they can read a short clip. They can look at those images and they're like, oh yes, there's a cowboy there. And, you know, it's saying this about Texas and, you know, the frontier spirit and, you know, conquering the West. They understand that it's a lot harder for them to do that in a Cormac McCarthy text, right? Like it's harder for them to unpack those skills. So we start where they're at and we try to move things in. This sort of discussion of the Alamo, like I said, we come back to it over and over again. I'll talk a little bit later about the Rafael Castillo, Remember the Alamo text, which I think is really great. We read an early letter by Juan Seguin. You may or may not know Juan Seguin. He was the first mayor of San Antonio. I was teaching this letter a couple semesters ago. One of my students like, Dr. Earhart, Dr. Earhart. And I was like, yes. She's like, he's my great-great-great-grandfather. My name is Seguin too. And I was like, oh, wonderful. So we talked about family histories then of how these ideas come down. Juan Seguin's letter is very pointed about the position of Tejanos early on in San Antonio and the attacks that came from Anglos in San Antonio to get their land, right? So it's an early letter discussing those kinds of tensions, especially when San Antonio was definitely like a borderland, not just between the West and the East, but also between North and South, right? Because of the Mexico and the history there. We talk about things like the Alamo Village, which was the village that was built for John Wayne's movie, right? And when I did this, this is where you never know. Your students have so much knowledge that you don't know about. One of my students was like, hey, my grandfather helped to build the Alamo. I have a brick I can bring in from that prop they brought. And so he brought it in and talked about when he was a little kid, how he would go to this Alamo Village. And to him, it wasn't John Wayne, and that wasn't the narrative. He was a Latino man who emphasized what it meant for his father and his grandfather and their family stability. And I thought that was really, really interesting. All right, the other thing I do as we're getting started, as we're thinking about things, is bring in documentaries, all free, they're all out there. And of course, as you know, especially when if you end up online, it's really much easier to have students engaging with something other than your head on Zoom. So these documentaries might work really well. We're the Aggies, we start with Lyle, Lovett. But we do that in part because it shows Bryan, Texas, where most of the students go at some point and have experiences with. And we can talk about that idea of downtown Texas, right? So that comes in there. Lines in the Sand is a really great documentary if you're looking for sort of an overview of Texas. I know they've all had Texas history, but what I've found over and over again is there's one narrative of history they have, and sometimes we need to fill things in. I notice this especially when I teach my African-American lit class. I don't know what kinds of histories they've had, so I fill things in. Two other things I want to mention that I think work really well. Food documentaries. I have a whole section on foodways. And so I've always used the Anthony Bourdain Houston Parts Unknown. It's a wonderful documentary to show them because it really kind of talks about these multiple groups in Houston, immigrant groups like the Vietnamese boat people that come in and how they engage with the community. More recent groups such as Indian Americans coming into Houston. But the latest Taste of the Nation, which just came out by Padma Lakshmi, is wonderful. It focuses on El Paso and borderlands. And that is going to be an excellent documentary to get students to think about those contact areas. And food is a really disarming way to talk about borderlands and contact zones. So I will definitely be using that one. So I want to mention these to you all. The other thing when we're thinking about narratives and text that we can teach, remember that the TEKS emphasizes oracy. Now, I know that they're thinking about the students being able to present, but for students to be able to present, they need to think about what it means to be oral, to be able to have these sort of spoken text. And when I teach Texas Lit, I teach lots of things to help them think about oracy. So I teach folk tales. I teach La Llorona. I have them write their own folk tales. Tell me a story that your grandmother told you. Write it down. It's an easy, informal writing project. I teach corridos, right? I teach both historical and contemporary songs. I teach cowboy songs and I teach contemporary music. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those assignments in a bit. I'm looking at my time, seeing how I'm doing here, because I tend to be long-winded. Okay, I'm in good shape. Here's just a quick overview of some texts that I teach, and I want you to see the broadness of the text. And when we teach Texas literature, almost always we teach Sandra Cisneros, we teach Gloria Anzaldúa and Borderlands. And those are sort of key pieces. We almost always teach Cormac McCarthy. Many of us will teach Cabeza de Vaca. I always teach him because students are just amazed about this guy who has crash landed basically in Galveston and wanders all over Texas for 7 years and describes, you know, what West Texas looked like, what indigenous people were there, what kinds of foods people ate. So those are a couple pieces that I think are pretty standard for Texas Lit, but I found throwing some other bits and pieces in is really helpful. So Attica Locke is an African-American murder mystery writer. I've taught her Blackwater Rising. She also has a book called Bluebird, Bluebird, and they're murder mysteries, so they're easy for students to read. They have that plot that kind of pulls them along, but they're great ways to think about histories, right? These long histories of Texas. I teach a really fun Kinky Friedman section. He has this very funny guide to Texas etiquette. Molly Ivins works well. We're going to talk about Rafael Castillo in a bit. I teach some texts like God Save Texas, which is a wonderful sort of overview of Texas cultural identity by Lawrence Wright. So I kind of pull all these pieces together. But it's not just text, right? And that's what I really want you all to think about. I teach all kinds of other textual materials that aren't print, that aren't written. So we teach folk tales. So you can see there's a brief little piece up in the corner. It's Vincent Ventura's The Mystery of the Chupacabras. This is a book that is published by Horta Publica Press. You should know them. They're in Houston. They're a wonderful press. They're dedicated to bringing Latinx, Latino, Latina text back into print. This particular piece is a young adult piece, and it's a flip book. So one side is Spanish and the other side is English. For those of you teaching ESL, this kind of text could work. ESL students, this kind of text could work really well. I throw in some music. You can see Lyle Lovett is there. We read his music. We talk about foodways, we talk about folk tales, we talk about cowboy songs. And so I use those interspersed with the longer pieces that they have to read because, you know, it's hard to get them to read something that's longer. So we can do a short song and then jump to something a little longer, then move back to a folk tale. And that breaks it up a little bit and gets them engaged. Let's think about some of the writing parts of TEKS and how we can use that in relationship to these texts. TEKS says, compose literary texts such as fiction and poetry. Okay, right there, you have an entree into Texas folk tales, music, and poetry. So there's a link here. You can watch it on your own time by Joe Hayes, who's a wonderful storyteller. He tells one version of La Llorona. And so I always have my students write their own scary stories, right? If they don't have a family story, they can make up their own. But often they're like, oh, I'm going to tell you about this story or this thing that happened. And it doesn't feel as much of a chore because they're recounting something and it meets that TEKS criteria. We also look at things like cowboy songs, and these are available online. So you can pull down this whole John Lomax book. And if you know John Lomax, he's a wonderful resource. He was a folk collector, so he went all through the country collecting folk music. He was particularly fascinated with cowboy songs. He taught at both UT and A&M. And in fact, he collected this cowboy songs during the Great Strike at Texas A&M, which I had never heard of until I started studying John Lomax. Apparently the students at A&M got mad at the administrators and walked out of classes for a few months. And Lomax said, cool, I don't have to teach. I'll go collect cowboy songs and put them together. And so these songs are really great. That you read them like you read poetry, but you can hear them and think about then this mythology of the cowboy as it's developed in Texas. And Lomax also has collected prison songs from up and down the Brazos. He was the one that discovered Ledbetter. And so also if you're interested in work songs, they're also there and really important, especially if you're in a place like Sugar Land, Texas. You can connect with the local stories through Lomax's collection of prison songs, some from that area. We talk about corridos, and I love this. We talk about Lydia Mendoza, you know, sort of the first queen of Tejano music. And what's really great when I teach Mendoza, at some point we go to our library, our special collections library, and they have in the corner one of her beautiful handmade dresses. And students are like, the ones that knew Mendoza before, like, oh, her dress. Others are like, I know what that means. I understand what that means, right? And we often then will work from corridos to Selena. And it really works well. I've included a link here to a contemporary corridos. This was put out a few years ago, like maybe 2015. It's a corrido to Bernie Sanders that's really funny and wonderful. And the students are like, oh, it's not a dead genre. Like a lot of our students who aren't engaged, sort of the culture of corridos don't understand that it's not a dead genre, it's a living genre, right? And again, you never know what your students are going to bring to you. My one student said, my grandfather was a bracero, but he was also a singer, and he traveled the country singing. And it was really a wonderful story. She actually brought some songs in that her grandfather had performed and played them for us. So your students have materials they can bring in. It's just opening them the door to make them feel like they have the authority to discuss some of these things, because they have more than you know. I was thinking too, as the 4th of July went by, about the Freedom Over Texas event and how great that would play out in Texas literature, right? Like it is truly this diversity of Texas, especially that clip of the Houston Symphony with Trey the Truth. I mean, it is just wonderful. So anything you can pull in like that, that students think about as not literature, you can pull it into the classroom and they have authority. They're like, oh yeah, I know Trey the Truth. Did you see that? That was weird with the Houston Symphony. And then you can talk about that. Why does that seem weird to you? What does it mean to have like hip hop rap is so different than symphony? You know, like what does that tell us about genre? So one of the ways that I get students to write and think critically about music is I have this contemporary music assignment, and I'm not going to spend a long time on it. I don't want to run out of time to talk about the other things, but it's there in your packet, and they get one song that they're in charge of, right? And they write a critical analysis of that song. They write about lyrics, they write about videos, they write about album covers. And I give them the sample and let them go. Now you might want to put some parameters on it. I tell my students, I'm not going to worry about language. High school might be different. You might think about that. But I let them pick what kind of music they want to talk about. It gives them authority again and gets them writing. I want to jump to another piece that I have found very, very successful. And okay, I'm going to move a little more quickly. Is formal presentations, right? Oracy. They want us to teach our students formal presentation skills. And I've always done this through a built environment presentation. Texas A&M has all these amazing statues, some which are under discussion today. And what I say to them is, your job is to go out, look at that statue closely, think about that statue, and tell us about it in a presentation. And I give them some suggestions about how to do this. Now, if you can't do this physically, you can do this online. You can have them develop group projects. You can have them present to their fellow students. And it works really well, especially right now when these things are under discussion. Let's think a little bit about rhetorical analysis. And this is kind of the last piece I want to spend a little more time talking about. So the TEKS says that, you know, they want you to teach students this sort of deep rhetorical analysis. Maybe using personal essays. That's easier for them to write. Maybe using explanatory essays, right? We want them to think about these texts in genre characteristics and craft. Um, how do they do that rhetorical analysis? How do they think about it? Now, we obviously need to keep them focused on the text at some point, right? The literary text. But I found that there are ways to supplement that that make them feel a lot more comfortable when they get to the point where they're like, okay, now I have to analyze this short story or this poem. Instead of sort of freezing, we've done all this work. We've talked about how songs are poems, and look how comfortable you are understanding that. Then here's an actual poem. Bring the same skill sets to that. How did you think about the music? How did you break it down? Why do you have refrains over and over again in music? How does that play out in poetry? So we're bridging it, right? We're taking them from informal analysis and writing that they feel comfortable with and bringing it over into these other skill sets that we want them to have, right? I find the same thing works with the sort of big project or big paper approach, right? In college, we almost always have that big assignment at the end of the semester, cumulative, all your skills have built up to it. And what I found, especially for my Texas Lit class, is a lot of times students who end up in Texas Lit class, I rarely get English majors. I rarely get humanities folks. I have engineers, comp sci, business, ag. You know, I have this wide group of students who maybe this group hasn't spent as much time crafting the essay like English majors have. So I've realized over the years that what I need to do is make sure that my assignments are pointed for their skill sets. And I think this is true in high school, right? We have to be very careful about how we design these projects because we don't want them to flounder and fail. So what I've come up with, and you can sort of make this bigger or smaller as it seems fit for your class and your level and what you need to get out of your students by the end of the semester or the end of the year. I've spent a lot of time working with something called the UNESSAY. Instead of torturing my students and myself with like a 20-page paper at the end of the semester, we have smaller formal assignments as we move through the class, like maybe a response to a particular short story or a poem, formal with, you know, external sources. But instead of that huge essay at the end, I give them choices. I tell them, you can write the traditional essay. Here's the normal prompt, you know, 15 to 18 pages, X number of sources on this kind of academic question. They can do that if they want. But I also give them the option of the UNESSAY. And this is really important for my students that are not English majors and feel pretty uncomfortable with the writing. The UNESSAY is more of a creative project with a written piece underlining it. So I'll show you the prompt in a minute, but basically I give them free range. And you're seeing some examples of what they've come up with. The centerpiece is not mine, but I wanted to include it because you see a quilt there. I have one student who loved this project and she said, my UNESSAY is going to be quilting with my grandmother because my grandmother's skill in quilts is something very important to Texas. And she made this beautiful Texas quiltlet. It was her first attempt. She did it with her grandmother. So she talked about that in her written piece about how this was part of a long history in her family and what it meant. I had a student down, you can see down in the corner, he was from El Paso. He made a family dish and he talked about what it meant to come to College Station where no one really understood his culture. He felt like he went from El Paso where he was not a minority and he came to College Station and he's like, wait, I'm so used to El Paso being one of many. What is this here? And it made him sort of critically think back on what about El Paso shaped him. And so his was a foodways assignment. In fact, a lot of students did cookbooks. They went home over Thanksgiving, talked to their grandmothers, talked to their aunts. One student did this great thing where his family over Thanksgiving had given up on the whole idea of turkeys. They didn't like that. That was not for them. And what they did is each auntie would bring a tamale. And all the aunties were from different parts of Mexico and South America and Central America. So they all had kind of a different style of tamales. And it was sort of a competition. So he talked about this and he took pictures and he wrote down the recipes and he talked about this diversity even within his own family and what that meant to him, right? I had students do paintings. You can see a painting down there. And what they really got interested in this, right? I had students put Spotify playlists together. I had students put Instagram essays together. I had them put movies. One student had a family deer lease, and she made this lovely movie about what the deer lease meant to her family, and she interviewed like her grandparents and talked to them about the lease, right? So there's lots of ways to engage your students with this, and they get excited about it. Here's the prompt. It's really wide open. You may choose to narrow this if it works for you. I give them full range, but what I do is I have them talk to me about what they're going to do early in the semester. And then they write a short piece that explains to me what they're going to do. So we're having like sort of a early writing piece. So I make sure that they're going in the right direction, but that they're writing about their ideas, right? That really helps. And again, this essay prompt is in your material, so you don't have to worry about writing it down. I give them lots of examples. This was not my idea. I saw some other people doing this. Some people I know, Dan O'Donnell, who's a professor in Canada, started this. So I said, I'm stealing that. I'm going to take it and modify it. The most important piece with this, though, is the written document. And you can shape this as you want. But what I tell them is, it is a personal reflection. You can bring in external sources if you want. But what you should tell me is what I need to know. And by that, I mean, what does this mean in relationship to the class? What kinds of themes connected to the class are you going to explain or talk about? We look at other essay written pieces and their object and talk about how they work together, right? So I had one student, she was from near Brownsville, and she did this lovely thing. She had a trunk, a small trunk, and she filled it with pieces of her culture. So she had her quince flowers. She was in a folklorica dance group, so she put a video CD with all her performances as well as her shoes. She put her first communion cross and Bible. I mean, she gave me this thing, and I thought, what trust that she's giving me these really important pieces of her life. But what she wanted to show, and she talked about this in her writing prompt, she hadn't really thought critically about what it meant for her to have this kind of cultural identity until she came to a very different place in College Station. And she wrote about how that connected to this long history of Texas literature. It connected to Ansel Dua's Borderlines. It connected to Cisneros. It connected to folk tales. And she had this beautiful piece about what all of these pieces together meant for her within this long line of literature. So you can get really, really great pieces out of your students. Now the grading, you can handle this how you want. I do it sort of loosey-goosey because again, I'm not grading so much the final project. I tell them, look, even if you're not an artist, you might choose to do an art piece. What's important about that art piece is your thinking behind it, right? You're theorizing the stuff we've talked about all along. So these are the kinds of questions I ask. Now you can take these and shape these specifically for your particular needs in your classroom. Again, you might confine it because your students might need more guidance, right? We did a lot of class prep getting to this point. I will tell you, and I'm almost out of time, I will emphasize one thing about all of the stuff I've showed you. I've taught online classes since 1998. When we started teaching online courses, actually it might have been 1997, we didn't have course management systems. We used email and we stuck stuff on the open web, which we had to hand code. What I've learned over this numerous years of teaching online is the best thing to get your students to do when you're online are projects. They can do projects when they're at a distance. You can support them in a much easier way than you can by just lecturing at them. So as we sort of have this disruption and we don't know what we're moving toward, some of these projects, the UNESSAY, the built environment presentation, all those kinds of things, the music work, they're going to be far more engaged and find that easier to stay on task with than just Zoom lectures. So think about that also as you move forward, and we're sort of in this state of uncertainty. Even adding one project-based thing, whether it's collaborative or individual, it's going to be easier and more engaging to your students at this time where we're really not sure where we're going. So with that, I'm going to close out my presentation. I am going to return